Picture this. You're on a crowded subway platform in Tokyo. A tourist from New York steps onto the train, takes up 2 seats, talks loudly on his phone, and eats a sandwich. Nobody says a word, but the looks he gets are unmistakable. Not angry, not confrontational, just quiet, disappointed, like he's broken something invisible that everyone else can clearly see. And here's what I find fascinating about that moment. The tourist thinks he's just being himself, free, taking up space in the world. To the Japanese commuters around him, he's doing something else entirely. He's choosing himself over everyone in that car. In Japan, those two things aren't celebrated as the same. One is freedom, the other is selfishness. The question worth asking is which side is actually right. I want to be honest with you up front. I didn't come into this topic with a clean slate. I grew up in a culture that told me self-expression was everything. Speak your mind, stand out, put yourself first and call it confidence. And I believed that for a long time. Then I started reading the research on Japanese psychology, and I had to sit with some uncomfortable questions. Because the data doesn't let you off the hook easily. Studies comparing self-reported agency found that 79% of Americans believe they have significant control over their own lives. In Japan, that number drops to 37%. Now, most Westerners hear that and immediately think, well, that's sad. But here's what I think we're missing. That gap might not mean Japanese people feel trapped. It might mean they've never been told that everything is about them in the first place. The concept at the center of all of this is called abue. It translates roughly as harmony, but that word doesn't quite capture it in English. War isn't just about being polite or keeping the peace. It's a foundational belief that the group's well-being comes before any individual's preferences. From childhood, Japanese people are taught that their actions ripple outward, that emotional restraint is a form of care, that staying quiet in a moment of frustration isn't weakness, it's consideration. There's a proverb most people have heard, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. In the West, we use that phrase as a warning, a cautionary tale about conformity crushing the individual. In Japan, it's historically been read differently, not as a threat, as a reminder, that sticking out has a cost, and that cost falls on everyone around you. Now here's where most Western takes on this get it completely wrong. People hear about woe, about group harmony, about self-suppression, and they immediately frame it as oppression, as if every Japanese person is walking around secretly resentful, just waiting for permission to be themselves. The research tells a much more complicated story. A meta-analysis comparing individualism scores between Japan and the United States found a difference of just 2.2 points on a 100-point scale. 2.2. These cultures that we treat as philosophical opposites are barely separated on the actual data. So the binary we've built in our heads, the free West versus the conformist East, that binary is largely a myth. And I think understanding that is where this conversation gets genuinely interesting. Here's my honest opinion on why this myth persists. Western cultures need a contrast. We need a foil that makes our version of freedom look obviously correct. And Japan is easy to cast in that role because the surface differences are real and vivid. The orderly train lines, the silence in public spaces, the way people carry themselves small, careful not to impose. To a Western visitor, that can look like suppression. But here's the thing. What looks like self-erasure from the outside often feels like respect from the inside. And I'm not asking you to immediately agree with that. I'm just asking you to hold both possibilities at the same time before you decide which culture got it right. There's a cognitive dimension to this that I personally find kind of mind-bending. Research from the University of Michigan used eye tracking to compare how East Asian and American participants look at images. Americans tend to focus on the central object in a picture. East Asian participants spent significantly more time scanning the background, the context, the relationships between things. Think about what that means at a deeper level. It's not just a visual preference. It potentially shapes how you understand cause and effect, how you assign blame, and how you see yourself in relation to everything around you. Japanese cognition, researchers argue, is more holistic, more attuned to the full scene. Western cognition tends to isolate the individual element and analyze it separately. Neither approach is wrong, but they do produce very different societies. Let's talk about the school system because this is where it becomes concrete. In Japan, students clean their own classrooms. Every day. No janitors during school hours. The kids sweep, mop, wipe down the desks, take out the trash. And they do it without being nagged. without a reward system, without a chart on the wall with gold stars. Why? Because the school isn't just teaching them math, it's teaching them who they are. You clean the space because the space belongs to all of you. Your mess is everyone's problem. Your effort contributes to something shared. In Western schools, we tend to separate academic achievement from character formation. We teach kids to excel individually and then hope they'll figure out community on their own. Japan builds it in from age 4. The workplace follows the same logic. Studies on cross-cultural management have found that American leadership tactics, specifically individual competition and personal reward structures, actively backfire in Japanese work environments. Pitting employees against each other for bonuses doesn't increase productivity in Japan. It damages relationships and lowers output. Group rewards, shared goals, collective recognition. Those work. And here's what I find worth sitting with. We often assume the American model is just better because it drives innovation. And there's some truth in that. Individual competition can accelerate certain kinds of progress. But Japan produced bullet trains, world-class manufacturing precision, and some of the lowest crime rates in the developed world. That didn't happen through every person optimizing for themselves. Now I want to get to the part nobody talks about honestly, because war has a shadow side, and pretending it doesn't would be intellectually dishonest. The same cultural pressure that creates extraordinary public order also creates something called hikikomori. It's a Japanese term for people, mostly young men, who withdraw completely from society. They retreat into their rooms for months, sometimes years. Some researchers link this directly to the weight of conformity. The expectation of idealized behavior in Japan is so high, and the consequences of failing to meet it are so public, that some people find total isolation preferable to the risk of social failure. That's not a small thing, and it sits uncomfortably alongside all the genuine beauty in Japanese collectivism. Freedom has real costs, but so does harmony. Japan is also changing. More recent studies show a measurable drift toward individualism, particularly among younger generations. Children who grew up with the internet, with global media, with exposure to Western values around self-expression and personal identity, they're questioning the old framework, moving out earlier, marrying later, prioritizing personal fulfillment in ways their grandparents would find confusing. And here's what the data shows about that shift. It's not making Japanese young people happier. This coexistence of rising individualism alongside deeply ingrained collectivist norms is creating psychological friction. People caught between two operating systems that don't fully run together, which makes me think the answer isn't to just pick one and declare it the winner. Here's where I land personally, and I want to be clear this is my opinion. I think the West has overcorrected. We took individual freedom, which is genuinely valuable, and we inflated it into a kind of self-mythology. The idea that your personal authenticity is always the most important thing in any room, that asserting yourself is inherently brave, that fitting in is inherently small, and we've paid for that in loneliness, in fractured communities, in public spaces that feel like nobody is responsible for anyone else. I'm not romanticizing Japan. The pressure to conform has real victims, but I do think there's something worth borrowing from a culture that asks its citizens, from childhood, to consider the person standing next to them. The specific practices matter here. In Japan, there's a term, sunao, that describes a quality parents actively try to cultivate. It's sometimes translated as docility, which sounds alarming to Western ears, but the actual meaning is closer to an open, harmonious responsiveness to the people and environment around you. Not blind obedience, not the absence of self, a kind of attunement. A child raised with sunao learns that their feelings are real and valid, and also not always the most important thing in the room. That tension between inner life and outer responsibility is exactly what Western parenting often fails to teach. We validate every feeling, we protect every preference, and then we're surprised when children grow into adults who struggle to share space. What this comes down to, I think, is a question of what freedom is actually for. In the West, freedom means the right to be exactly who you are without interference. In Japan, freedom has historically been understood as something more relational. You are free when your community is stable enough to support you. You are free when the people around you aren't suffering because of your choices. Neither definition is complete on its own, but a society built entirely around the first version starts to look, from the outside, a lot like what Japan calls selfishness. And a society built entirely around the second can become its own kind of cage. The most honest thing I can tell you is that both cultures are still working that out.